Welcome to the 6th video in our series of quilts and projects using 5-inch squares or charm packs. This pattern is called Charm Star. It's available for free on the Moda Fabrics website. We will leave a link in the description below to the pattern. You will need 3/4 of a yard of a background fabric. From the background fabric, cut 1 strip that's 9.5 inches by the width of fabric and 3 strips that are 5 inches by the width of fabric. This fabric is from a line called Fiesta by Moda, and it's designed by me and my sister Designs. From the 9.5 inch by width of fabric strip, subcut 4 squares that are 9.5 inches by 9.5 inches. I folded my strip, so I'm cutting through 4 layers at once. If you're not comfortable stacking the layers like this, you can cut them 1 at a time or 2 at a time. I'm stacking 2 of my 5-inch strips together, and the other one I have folded in half. From the long strips that are 5 inches by width of fabric, I'm going to cut 4 rectangles that are 5 inches by 18.5 inches. From the one strip that's folded in half, I'm going to cut 8 squares that measure 5 inches by 5 inches. When cutting multiple layers like this, you want to double check your measurements, because if you make one mistake, you're actually making 4, so always double check that you're on the right marks. When you're cutting multiple layers, it can save a lot of time. For your inner border fabric, you need 1/3 yard of fabric. From this fabric, you need to cut 4 strips that are 2 inches wide by the width of fabric. The pattern will tell you to cut them down to 2 at 39.5 inches and 2 that are 36.5 inches, but I usually wait till my quilt top is done so I make sure the measurements are correct. For the outer border and binding, you need 1.5 yards of a border print. For this one, we will be cutting parallel to the selvage, not across the width of the fabric. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut off the selvage. And then I'm going to cut 4 strips that are 5 inches wide by the length of the fabric. By cutting the length of the fabric versus the width, you won't have to piece the outer border. The pattern tells you to cut 2 of the strips 48.5 inches long and 2 of the strips 39.5 inches long. I'm going to wait until I've got my inner border fabrics on and measure the quilt and cut according to those measurements. You also need to cut 4 strips that are 2.5 inches by the length of fabric. These will be used for your binding. I saved my leftover fabric from this piece. There's a big chunk kind of in the middle, and I used it to help me make my backing. The pattern calls for 3 yards for a backing, but I was able to get by with 1.5 yards by using my leftover pieces. And then you just need 1 charm pack for the star. I'm going to lay out my star points backgrounds and then kind of build my star from there. You need 4 star point sections and 1 center section. This charm pack has 42 squares, so I'm going to take out the 2 lightest ones that match the background and then use the rest for the star. I think it would be best if the star points are a little bit darker, and then the lighter fabrics can go in the center. I'm also going to try to spread out the colors a little bit so that I don't end up with all of the oranges in one spot or all of the purples in one spot. Each of the star point sections need 1 rectangle of the background, 2 background squares, and 6 of the charm squares. Once I had the pieces arranged to my satisfaction, I set them aside so I could arrange the center of the quilt. Mostly it's just the lighter pieces that are left, along with a few of the darker ones, so I kind of want to make sure I spread those around a little bit too. By pre-planning where the pieces will go, there are fewer mistakes and I can make substitutions if I need to. Now that it's all arranged, it's time to start sewing. For the construction of this quilt top, use 1/4 inch seam allowances unless directed otherwise. Of course, I can't just show you one colorway. I need to make another sample for you so you can see it in a different set of colors. For the second quilt, I'm going to use charm packs. One is called Holly Jolly by Urban Chicks. The other one is called Once Upon a Christmas by Sweet Fire Road Design Company, both from Moda. Both of these charm packs have a vintage or retro Christmas look. For the background fabric, I picked a light fabric that was the background color of the top two pieces in these charm packs. To make the charm star, I'm going to pick the darkest pieces from both of these charm packs, and then I'm going to save the lighter pieces from both of these charm packs to use for the border. So I won't be cutting a border fabric. I'm just going to use the leftovers from the charm packs to make a border. The darkest pieces will be used for the star points, and then I'll use whatever's left over for the center, and then after that, all the rest of the fabrics will go in the border. Any charm pack will work for this fabric, but if your charm pack has a lot of light fabrics in it, you either want to save them for the center or get two charm packs so that you can pick out the dark pieces for the center star. Because I'm going to use all these extra pieces for my border fabric, all I needed to do was purchase some extra fabric for the inner border, and then I'm also going to use that fabric for the binding. For the inner border, I'm going to cut 4 strips that are 2 inches by the width of fabric, and for the binding, I will cut 5 strips that are 2.5 inches by the width of fabric. Now it's time to head to the sewing machine. For the star points, you're working on 2 at a time, and you will make 4 of them, 1 for each side of the center square. On the wrong side of the 4 charm squares, draw a line from corner to corner. Layer 2 of the 5-inch charms with 2 of the background squares, right sides together. With the right sides together, put the other 2 5-inch charms on each end of the 5-inch by 18.5-inch background rectangle. Make sure that the lines that you drew mirror each other. I did pin the squares to the rectangle so they would stay in place when I was sewing the other end. Now all you have to do is sew on the lines that you drew. Once you've sewn the line, you're going to trim the seam down to 1/4 inch and discard the excess fabric. Or you can sew a line, another line 1/2 inch away from the first line, cut in between the 2 lines, and then you'll have a spare half-square triangle unit that you can use in another project. I don't like to waste fabric, so I generally will sew the extra line and keep those half-square triangle units for something fun. Stay to the end of the video to see how I used them for this project. When cutting between the 2 lines, you can either use a scissors or you can head to your cutting mat and cut it with a rotary cutter. I've got one of the star point sets complete, and now I just need to sew the other 3. When I'm done sewing these, I'm going to take them to the cutting mat and cut them with my rotary cutter. While I'm still at my sewing machine, I'm going to sew the center squares together into 4 rows of 4 squares. If this is the first video you've seen in our Charm Pack series, check the description below for a link to the playlist of all of our Charm Pack videos. While I was at the sewing machine working on the Fiesta version of this Charm Star quilt, I also sewed my Christmas version. Now that I have everything cut apart, it's time to press. I'm going to press away from the background fabric, but you could also press these seams open. Once pressed, the larger half square triangle blocks will measure 5 inches by 5 inches. Once pressed, I trimmed all of the smaller half square triangle blocks to 4¼ inches by 4¼ inches. I've learned over time to press those extra half square triangle blocks as I'm pressing whatever it is I'm working on. I ended up with a huge pile of unpressed half square triangle blocks after a particular project, and it took a while for me to get through that. So now I just do them as I'm going along. When pressing the rows for the center square, press every other one the opposite direction. That way you can nest the seams when you sew them together. And while the iron is hot, I'm going to press my Christmas version also. For each of the 4 star point sets that you make, lay it out as the pattern shows. Piece the 2 half square triangle blocks to the 2 charm squares. Make sure that the background fabric in the center forms a larger triangle. Once sewn together and pressed, this unit will measure 5 inches by 18½ inches. Before I head over to the ironing board to press these, I'm going to sew my rows together for the center of the star. I'm also working on the Christmas version before I head to the ironing board. For the center square, I'm going to press all the seams in one direction. For the star point sections, I'm going to press the center seam open, and then I'm going to press toward the charm squares. Now it's time to piece the star point rectangle units to each other. Make sure that the background fabric makes a very large triangle. Once sewn and pressed, this unit should measure 9½ inches by 18½ inches. I did take the time to pin these units together to make sure that my seams would line up. I thought I'd throw in a quick charm pack update on how I'm doing with my piles of charm packs that I have. So at the start of this project, I had 49 charm packs. For these 2 quilts, I used 3 charm packs, but then I added 6 more charm packs to my pile. So now I'm at 52, which I seem to be going backwards in how many I have, but that's okay. I'll use them. For this unit, you want to press to the piece that has the most background fabric. Now it's time to assemble the 3 rows for the quilt center. You're going to add the 9.5-inch background squares onto opposite ends of 2 of the star point units. The other star point units will be sewn onto opposite sides of the center unit made of the 16 squares. Some of those seams won't nest, especially if you press towards the darker fabric and not pressed your seams open, so I recommend pinning here just to make sure all those seams line up. When I first started quilting, I didn't like to do a lot of pinning, but I've learned that there are certain times when pinning helps things turn out much better. For the 2 outer rows, you want to press toward the 9.5-inch squares or away from the center point unit. For the center row, you will also want to press away from the star point units or toward the center square. Now it's time to add the outer rows to the center row. I pinned on both of the rows before I started sewing. Once you're done sewing this section and pressing it, press towards the outer rows. It should measure 36.5 inches by 36.5 inches. If it does, now is the time to cut your inner border pieces to 36.5 inches and 39.5 inches. You're going to add the 36-inch pieces to opposite sides, press towards the inner border fabric, and then add the last 2 pieces. If your quilt top has a different measurement, you want to cut your pieces to that length, sew onto opposite sides, remeasure, and then cut the last 2 pieces, whatever that measurement is. Measuring for any border is especially important because you don't want your pieces to bubble or to be wavy. Once you're done, this should measure 39.5 inches by 39.5 inches. And if that's true, then you can cut your outer border pieces to measure 39.5 inches long and 48.5 inches long. If your measurements are off, that's all right. Just measure what you have, cut it to that length, and then add them on. You always want to press before you add on the next set of border strips. The finished size of this quilt is 48.5 inches by 48.5 inches. Once you're done adding the last border, give it a final press, and then you need to layer it with batting and backing and quilt it. I quilted this on my long arm machine and used a big loop pattern. I used cotton batting and I used white thread for the quilting. If you remember, I used 2 charm packs at the beginning to get enough pieces for the center star. The work on the Christmas version is continuing as well. And then I picked out a single pattern to use for the inner border and for the binding. For the outer borders, I'm going to take the leftover charm square pieces that I had, sew them together, and make units long enough to sew to the opposite sides of the quilt. And then I'll have enough left over to do that again to make it go all the way around. The center square on each side had to be shortened to make the units fit along the side. The center rectangle on each side, where you're sewing the squares together, you need to have a rectangle in the middle. Should be 3.5 by 5, but yours may vary depending on your seam allowances and how your inner border was measuring. So just kind of play around with that a little bit till you get the measurement right. One trick that I've learned is just to pin the center in place and then sew it down. That way, if it's not right, you don't cut it off first and then need to have more fabric in there. So measure it, mark it, check it after you've sewn it, and then cut the excess fabric off. By using 2 charm packs to make this pattern, I didn't need to buy a border fabric, and I only had 4 squares left over at the end. I was really happy with the way that the Christmas version turned out. 48 by 48 for a finished size of a quilt is just a little bit off. You can't use a single width of fabric for the backing, so you either have to find a wider fabric or you have to piece it. Do you remember those extra half square triangle units we made with the leftovers? I was a little sneaky with mine. I pieced all of mine together in a different arrangement for each of my quilts, and then used the extra fabric I had and pieced it into the back so I could get it wide enough, a section wide enough, so I could just use one length of fabric for the backing. So instead of needing 3 yards for backing, I only needed 1.5 yards, and then I put the extra pieces in the middle. I also used the long arm to quilt my Christmas version in a smaller loop pattern. I used an off-white thread and cotton batting. For the backing on the Christmas version, I did a flying geese in the center, and I had to use a little bit more backing fabric to go on the ends of the flying geese part. Very fun finishes for both of my quilts. We hope you will remember to hit the like button, leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!